Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yvonne Miller. I'm Professor of Design Psychology and Director of the QUT Design Lab at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. And I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon. At the outset, let me pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of where I am today in Brisbane, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and to acknowledge the critical contribution that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make to the QUT community. I think it's quite timely when we're thinking about climate change and how we might care for the land. It's quite timely to think about and pay respect to how our Indigenous elders have related to the land for thousands of years and how we might be inspired by that. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about older Australians and climate change, draw on a few different projects, and I guess prosecute the argument that are they casualties, contributors, or change agents? Oh, sorry, I'm in someone else's office to do this, and there's never ending technological challenges. It doesn't matter whether you're pre-recorded or live. So as I said, I'm going to draw on three qualitative projects. A Living Smart Homes initiative, where we worked with residents on the Sunshine Coast, and two projects that my PhD students did, or former PhD students, looking at how older adults experience the Brisbane floods and cyclones in far north Queensland. At the outset, though, I think it's important just to remind ourselves about the impact that population ageing will have and how that will feed into issues of climate change and of vulnerability if we have more significant weather events. I think we all know, with this audience, we all know the reality of population ageing, but it's a really good reminder to think that life expectancy at birth, 20 years from now, will be age 90. And it's important to think about how that's going to change our day-to-day lives. So right now, Queen Elizabeth sends a congratulation card, a birthday card, to Australians who turn 100. And she sends just over 2,500 of those right now. But in the next 20 years, by 2044, she, or perhaps Princess Kate, will be sending nearly 20,000 such letters. There'll be 20,000 Centaurians in Australia compared to 2,500 now. And it's a significant growth, and I think it really brings home how the structure of our population is changing, and we need to think much more innovation and thought and time about how we're going to respond to the opportunity and challenges associated with population ageing. And in that, there is, of course, climate change, or the climate emergency. So I've got three propositions for you today, and the first one is one that I'm not sure that we all think of very often, but it is a possibility, and that is that older people are contributors to climate change. So in one of those studies where we talked with older people about sustainability initiatives, they made the point that potentially the baby boomer generation could be held to be responsible for the climate emergency. And let me read this quote. "Will we be here in 20 years? It's what we leave for you. We don't really want it to be a nightmare. We don't want to be labelled the nightmare generation that left you the mess. Although I don't personally feel responsible, that's how it's sort of coming out, and it could be labelled where the baby boomers have done good and bad things." And so there was a narrative here and a positioning that potentially this was our actions, our mess, and our responsibility to clean up. And that older people could, in the future sort of version of events, be held to blame for the climate emergency and the consequences of inaction. The second proposition is one that we're perhaps more familiar with, and that is older people as casualties of climate change. And as I said, I'm going to talk about two of my PhD students' studies, focusing on older people's experience of the Brisbane floods and also the tropical cyclones in far north Queensland. Now, the impacts of disasters vary widely in terms of the amount and the nature of the stress they involve, and it really depends on the duration of the disaster, the loss of life, the personal injury or injury to loved ones, the damage to property, the terror, whether the sights are gruesome, the sounds and the smells, whether people are dislocated from their homes for a few hours, a day, a few weeks, months or longer, and the availability of social support. All of these factors, they may differ, and they do differ depending on the type of disaster, so a flood or an earthquake, cyclone, and between how each person experiences the same flood. It really does differ. And when disaster strikes, older adults are often uniquely vulnerable and disproportionately negatively affected. So we often talk about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and how older people there were the most negatively impacted. So 71% of people killed were aged 60 years or older, even though older people were only 15% of the population. Now, of course, there are factors in there of systematic racism and poverty and social class, but when we look at other disasters, all too often older adults are overrepresented in those that have been either killed or maimed or most negatively impacted. So over half were killed in the Kobe earthquake were older adults. Highest death rate, Paris heat wave, was age 70 plus, and similarly the tsunami. And when it comes to cyclones in far north Queensland, there's a really clear sense that everybody must fend for themselves. They've got to be responsible for themselves. And so in this research, my then PhD student, Sandy Astle, explored what old people themselves thought, as well as disaster managers, emergency workers, and healthcare workers. And the older people spoke a lot about how the fear, basically, and watching the stress and fear on their spouse's face, and knowing that there's going to be no assistance, and just feeling really worried, and relied on the kindness of strangers to survive and prepare for the cyclone, and they found it really difficult. And similarly, the emergency community health workers identified similar issues. They talked about the physical reality, older people trying to climb ladders and fix roofs was really challenging. Many were disabled and caring for ill partners. Many didn't have a car, so transport was a challenge. And there's just a sense of vulnerability, particularly when, it's often the case, there is, just one natural disaster and then another. You just got to keep on going. And older people themselves were really worried that they wouldn't be able to age in the place of their choosing. So they spoke about, the realities of aging is that your stamina decreases, and they found it hard to lug sandbags, and being knackered. It was just a lot of energy. Worries about, what happens when a spouse dies. Right now they're doing okay, but if their husband died, then what? And also just, where to go. Evacuation facilities were full and they were told to go somewhere else, and they spent the night in the car. It was just really challenging. And there's a similar experience in the Brisbane floods. And they just, again, whilst in this context, older people didn't see themselves as vulnerable, but they did rely heavily on family and friends and neighbours for practical assistance, to quote. In this project, Lauren Brockner and I used a unique method called research poetry, or it's creating poems or poem-like prose from interview transcripts. And so instead of presenting a quote, you present a poem. Let me read this one. It's called Sink or Swim. I'm 74. I was born 1939. I'm not as strong as I used to be. Can't lift things. When it starts to rain, when they predict a storm, say strong winds, flash flooding, it's hair raising. You think, is it on again? You think, what am I going to do? You think, what if it's just Mrs. and I here? You think, what am I going to do? And you can feel, I think, the sense of fear here. And we see the same in this poem, On My Own. It's a real sense of social isolation. I'm on my own, been here 9 years. I don't see anyone. I couldn't tell you the name of anyone. Wouldn't know them if I fell over them. I'm on my own here. There were a lot of people, police and emergency crews going around, but they never stopped. I just did what I could by myself. I can't lift furniture, impossible. I did what I could. I loaded my car until I couldn't get any more in, and then I said goodbye to the rest of it. Nobody came to help me. I did get a text message to say get out. I did get that. I think that's a really, poignant and emotional conveying of what it can be like to face a natural disaster and prepare for it when you're alone in the community. The third proposition I have for you is that older people might be change agents for climate change. That is, they might lead the charge. I think most of us, when we think of our retirement, we probably think of, lying on the beach, reading books, hanging out with kids and grandkids, maybe giving back to the community, volunteering in some way. But few of us will think of, climate activism. And yet that was what some of our participants spoke about in one study. They spoke about how, and I quote, my hobby is sort of global warming and climate change and peak oil. And that made me think about, well, could this be reframed as a hobby? And to look into Stephens' work. So Stephens just talks about casual leisure and serious leisure. So casual leisure is the things you do for fun, like yoga and golf, watching TV. But serious leisure is when you're committed to something. There's a real time commitment, requires training, is often cost and sacrifice. And so he talks about serious leisure activities might be to be an amateur musician or a citizen scientist. And I wondered, maybe we could reframe it so that serious leisure was to be a climate change activist. So as I alluded to originally at the beginning of this presentation, this is a project where we looked at the evaluation of a sustainability, climate change, behaviour change initiative. As part of that, we had focus groups with participants. So we found that the participants were pretty sustainable anyway, and most of them were older people. And they talked about how they were living a sustainable lifestyle in a non-sustainable world. And there was a real sense that we needed to return to traditional lifestyles, that we needed to embrace the frugal lifestyles that perhaps our grandparents had lived, and we need to move away from this throwaway, consumable society and just live differently. As one participant said, I quote, "I find it hard to say young women, they tend to be using consumerism as a hobby. They go to shop, do you know what I mean? They go to the mall. I don't think it helps. And we need to change the conversation so that we move away from wanting to have these sort of fashionable things to things that are reliable and durable. And to lead and make leading a sustainable lifestyle in a non-sustainable world much more mainstream." Second theme that came through really strongly was that they made sacrifices to be sustainability role models. And I think we often just think, oh, you're just, we might be leading a sustainable life. We don't realise the sacrifice that comes from that. So for these older Australians, being a role model to others and contributing to solving the problem of climate change was a real part of their identity. However, they still experienced challenges and disappointment and struggle. One woman was building a house and she really wanted to build a pool as well, but she knew, she had a sense that that wasn't the right sustainable decision, so she was going to sacrifice that. And they also often challenged themselves to deepen their commitment. So they were learning about different things and experimenting. So it might be a no shopping challenge, a buy nothing new challenge, or teaching neighbours how to build a worm farm. There's kind of engagement, making sacrifices and making this real choice to be a sustainability role model. And I did note that, it wasn't easy. If you were perceived to be going out too far, you need to be careful that you weren't perceived to be a tree-hugging loony. So there's a real balance out there. And there was a strong sense that we had to make sustainability fashionable, so that everybody wants to do it. So there should be storylines on neighbours and home and away talking about sustainability. We should use shock tactics to motivate action. So for example, why don't we turn up all the petrol for a week and see what happens, have this conversation. And we need to reward behaviour change. So the rates are discounted if you engage with sustainability. We need to do these broader sustainable things to motivate action. And so I think we need to reframe the conversation and we need to think about how older people can be change agents for action on climate change. And one way to do that is to say, hey, sustainability could be a serious leisure activity. And as we think about what the cities and communities and homes of the future look like, we need to advocate not only for inclusive, age-friendly places, but we need to advocate for sustainable futures, for ones where sustainability becomes mainstream.